Hello horror fans, and welcome back to my channel. We got another wonderful review today. Today we're looking at a TV series of horror that was brought out by the BBC in 1981, and it's their telling of the Day of the Triffids. Now this came out in, well, it was first broadcasted in 1981. And it's based on a very sort of famous novel by John Wyndham, which was also made in a film in the 1950s in America. But this is the BBC's adaptation, and it ran over 6 episodes over 6 weeks, and it tells the story of a world that has been sort of like digested, if you like, by a living plant called a triffid. So these are sort of giant sort of plants that have seemed to have taken over the world, and it all begins sort of back in where these companies are sort of fighting for ownership of this oil, which has come from Russia, and they're sort of like excreting oil from these plants, and they're sort of like, and it's all about sort of substitution sort of food, if you know what I mean, because they're substituting oil and stuff like this, and all these plants are sort of like all grown like massive and all this kind of thing, and they've been growing more in these sort of farms to farm these plants, these triffids, and just so us humans can consume the oil from them. And it's these businessmen that have been trying hard to make millions and millions of pounds out of it, and they've got these special sort of like scientists working on the sort of like control of these plants, because these plants are poisonous and they have a little bit of a mind of their own, and they will attack you, and sort of like, and if they attack you and scratch you, you get poisoned, and within a few days you can die. And we see our main character, who's like one of the scientists who work on the farm, and he starts off in a hospital, and he is sort of covered with bandages, and he is because he's been stung, and it's affected his eyesight, because he was wearing the safety outfit, but he got like hit by this 10-foot plant, whacked him by the eye and broke through, and he got poisoned, and he was close to losing his eyesight. So he's in hospital trying to recover, and he can't see nothing, and he's sitting there, and he's talking to himself, and he's going over all these things that he's gone through, and he's writing down in a sort of like on his recording onto a cassette a sort of statements of what's been going on. I think he's planning on writing a book, because he wants to get out of this industry, because he doesn't like it, because he's fed up with it. And he talks about when he was a young boy, when he first come in contact with triffids, his dad kept like this sort of triffid in his garden, and they sort of nurtured it and nursed it, and they weren't quite sure what it was until it sort of like attacked him when he was a young boy, and he got scratched there. But because it was a young sort of triffid, the damage didn't kill him, it just made him very ill. And then his father came out and he sort of chopped down this triffid, and that was the first contact he had with a triffid. But then he went on to go and work with them in this triffid farm, and we see all these different sort of scenes of businessmen trying to figure out how to sort of cultivate this oil from these triffids, and it's costing tens of millions of pounds of deals and stuff like this. All this going on, and back at the hospital, our hero is sort of like waiting for the nurse to come to remove his bandages, but nobody comes, and he hears this noise, and so it sort of scares him, and he looks around, and realizes that it's gone past the time when the doctor said they were going to come to remove his bandages. He then starts talking back about um, an event that happened while he's bandaged up. There was a night of meteorites, and the whole sort of world was fascinated by this array of. They look out the window and you see all these sort of almost like a firework display of like meteorites coming down to Earth, like. And everyone was all fascinated about it. They all went on the roofs of big buildings and out in the streets in London and everywhere around the sort of planet. But what they didn't realize that the light coming off these meteorites was dangerous, and it's burned the retinas in their eyes, and they're all blind. Very, very few people, including our hero Bill, have survived getting blind because everyone has been watching this meteorite display, apart from obviously Bill, who was in bandaged up, and some people that were not looking at it. A young girl and her family that are suffering from it. She didn't see it. We meet our other sort of main character, a female who didn't suffer from it because she was recovering from a hangover, so she survives it. We've got all these characters. Anyway, so he takes off the bandages himself at the hospital, and then he goes around looking for help, and he can't find anyone. And then he sees his doctor, and his doctor is blind, and he says, "What's going on?" Because and then he searches the hospital a bit more, and he looks down a corridor of a stairway, and there's about 8 to 12 people, all blind, not knowing where to go. So he's absolutely now terrified, not sure what's happened, because he's been in this room isolated for all this time. Remind you of another film? We'll get to that in a minute. And then he he eventually comes out of the hospital looking for sort of help, and then we see our female character in a car driving around, and she comes across other humans that are blind, and these humans have turned in almost a zombie-like behavior, where because they can't see, they're all fighting for survival. They're looting the shops. They're sort of like attacking other humans. We've got one group of like football fans that one of them can see and the others can't, but they're making the most of it and not too bothered that they can't see. And they see this other girl and they grab her to try and rape her. And our hero's just come out of hospital, has seen this, and he goes over to help this blind girl. And so all this sort of thing happens, and then he meets up with the other female, and they sort of bond a little team together and go off to try and find remnants of her family and things like this, and try and survive these triffids that are now making advantage of what's happened, because no one can see. These triffids are now out there on the streets, and they are now the dominant force of the planet, because obviously all the humans have become blind and they can't see them, and so these triffids feed on human beings. What they do, they wait for their poison to take hold of the human, and the person dies, and then they feed upon that person. So that's where they get their food. They're carnivorous plants, and they are now suffocating the world of human beings, which is not a bad thing, really. But we see the streets of London empty. There's no one about. We see deserted, where we see people dead on the street. And this reminds me of a Danny Boyle film called 28 Days Later. And in fact, I believe in an interview with Danny Boyle, the director of that film, he said that he was massively influenced by this story and by this series of Day of the Triffids, because it does similar in many ways. We've got that begins in the hospital, and then he comes out and sees all London deserted, and then there's all these people affected by this virus, but these people are affected by the blindness from this meteorite, and all this sort of things going on. And then we got on top of that the triffids that are taking over to be the main sort of prominent life force on the planet, and they can move about. These are sort of like plants that are shaped like this, and they got this, and they can whip themselves and whip their sort of vines out to poison people, and they can move around with their sort of grotesque base of the plant. You see them moving around, and yes, it does look of its time, but it still looks pretty cool. If you don't pay attention to that it looks like somebody probably inside, or a trolley being pushed or wheeled. It does look quite effective still today. And I didn't really notice that. It didn't make any difference of like the effects of then and now. Today I still really enjoyed this program because it's a really good survival horror, and it's like you know, it reminded me of so many sort of films like War of the Worlds, and all these sort of strange sort of films of that time, the science fiction horror, and this is what this is, and it's a wonderful, wonderful adaptation by the BBC, and it ran over 6 episodes, and it's just had a Blu-ray release, which does contain all 6 episodes, a little making of it, and a booklet and a slipcase. The pluses of the edition released by the BBC is that it does look wonderful. They've restored it really well. It's in a smaller frame, a 4.3 frame, but again, to get that high definition 4K look, sometimes you have to sacrifice the wider picture to actually get that in a more pristine condition, and they've done it really, really well. The cast are fantastic in this. They've acted it really well. There's no major sort of stars that stand out like that you would know in the series, but it is a fantastic watch. Really, really cool. I loved every single episode, and it's quite gripping still, considering it's quite an old series. And it's really, really great to see it out on Blu-ray and getting a release and giving a new lease of life, because although it's made of 81, it's still cool today. And I believe they did make another sort of TV series in the 2000s, but I'd never seen that one. But I'm surprised that Hollywood or whoever hasn't picked this up yet and redone it into like a new adaptation with gore and stuff. But this is absolutely wonderful, and it is a real sort of fight for survival. You know, you've got your human beings that are blinded and acting in a zombified kind of way because they're doing everything they can to get food and survive. And you can see, and a few others can see, and then you've got this master race of carnivorous plants that are trying to take over the planet and feed off human beings. Wonderful. Guys, till my next video, please check out some more channels for me. Check out Horror Hands, The Horror Geek, Man v Film, RS Designs, Pizzawell. I'm the Ice Lord, Cat Watches Horror Movies, Grumpy Andrew's Haunted House, and a massive shout out to my lad. Till next time, look after yourselves, look after one another, and I really hope that I'll see you all soon.